All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the breakout session for lenses and their purpose. Thanks for joining us at Northern Exposure today. My name is Ben Brewer. I'll be moderating this. Please mute your audio if you wish. You can also turn off your video in the lower left-hand corner or make it more personal since it's a smaller group here. Either way is good. If you have a question during the presentation, use the chat function and the taskbar at the bottom of your Zoom window. Send your question to everyone. If you need to qualify it or anything like that, we can do voice that way as well. If you want to get the most out of the experience, we recommend viewing the presentation in speaker view versus gallery view. And you can change that setting in the upper right-hand corner up there. So without any further ado, I want to welcome Jillian Bell and thank her for leading this breakout session on lenses and their purpose. Jillian is a member of the National Technical Team for Tamron USA. As a photographer, educator, and artist, she travels the country leading hands-on photographic workshops, educating attendees at Photo Plus Expo, WPPI, and PPA trade shows. Her goal is to inspire others and help them to build on their photographic skills to create better, more consistent results. So, without any further ado, let's hand things over to Jillian.
That was great. Thank you, Ben. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Like he said, my name is Jillian. I go by Bell Tamron USA on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and most of my role, pretty much all of my role, is talking shop with photographers of all levels. Most of my experience comes from a vast array of retail management, about 10 years in this industry. I've been with Tamron now for 11 years now. And before that, I was everything from a successful freelance photographer. I live here in Minneapolis. And really my goal is to help people figure out how to get better at their craft. What kind of photographs do you want to take? And how can I help solve these problems? And, we learn together. I'm going to reshare my screen here. Give me just a moment. Ben, can you give me a thumbs up? You can see the slides okay? Perfect. Thank you. This is a presentation that I give through Tamron EDU. It's a student and academic initiative that I restarted a couple years ago through Tamron. And the goal here is to, again, get to know the property of optics, get to know why you'd use a telephoto versus a wide angle, what a macro lens does, kind of bring clarity to all those different myths that you might know or not know about lenses and optics. Like I said, I am personally sponsored by Tamron, but these are ideas and these are properties that you can apply to any brand. Doesn't matter what you shoot. The important thing at the end of the day is that you are actually out there photographing, challenging yourself and getting better at your craft. Lenses and their purpose. So again, we ask ourselves, what do you photograph? How do you see the world? What is your style? And are there tools that we can use to help you improve? The goal here is to help you decide, because just like tools in your toolbox or a shovel versus a trowel in the garden, all lenses have a purpose. And I'm going to help clarify these things over the next hour. It's going to be quick and brief. So if there's any specific things you want to know, I'm going to leave time at the end that we can discuss those in a more customized way. All right, this first slide kind of comes to my time in retail. When we talk about lenses, when we talk about what are we actually asking, if you as a consumer or myself can ask the right questions, that will help get to the answers faster. When we talk about a normal lens, this is just general terminology. When we talk about a normal lens, in a general term, we're talking about a 50mm lens. It's the closest to what we see with our eye. So our personal vision, if you close one eye and kind of look at what that angle of view looks like, it's different depending on what brand you shoot. It's different on what kind of lens you use, but it's anywhere from like a 42.5 to a 52 I've heard of. So like a 50mm lens is what we consider normal in the industry. If we go less than 50, so anything between a 24mm and a 50mm, this is considered a wide angle lens. Anything wider than a 24 millimeter is considered an ultra wide. So on the other end, we start back at 50 at normal. If we go above 50, everything from like a 50 millimeter to 100 millimeter is considered a telephoto lens. And then anything greater than a 100 millimeter is considered a super telephoto lens. These are things like, so if I have a customer that comes up and says, I want to get closer to things, we have to differentiate if we want to get closer to things that are 100 yards away, like a telephoto, or do you want to get closer to things that are small? That's a macro lens. This is the basics of a conversation that we have, again, to help clarify and to help solve these problems. Why is this important? Well, a wide angle lens has an expansive property to it. This is a great example. This is a 16 millimeter lens. I am very close to the archer's hand here. And when we have an expansive property, basically as your subject moves further away from that front element of the lens, it gets smaller very, very quickly. And so wide angle lenses are great for drama. They're great for adding line or depth. Anytime you want to like stretch out your scene, using a wider angle lens will help you do that. Now compare this to a telephoto lens. This is taken at 300 millimeters, same subject, same time of day. All I did was physically back up and zoom in. And this has a completely different look, yes? Where the distractions in the background all go away, my background gets nice and compressed up against my subject. I will use a telephoto lens if I have a very distracting background or if I just want to simplify and make it about the subject matter. Versus again, I'll go back to the wide angle. This is more about the lines and the expansion and just the stretching out of all the elements. Completely different look. Which one do you prefer? Depends on what the end result is. All right. What lens should I use? Now, this is a really loaded question. Honestly, it kind of depends on what your personal style is, what you see in your mind, and that's the major goal of this class. We want to be able to get to the end result faster. So how can I use my lens to translate what my vision is in my mind to get to these photographs faster? It depends, but for the most part, we use certain focal lengths for portraiture, we use certain focal lengths for landscape, we use certain focal lengths for wildlife, and this first section is going to kind of go through the norms to help you kind of check those boxes off. So for portraits, again, you can honestly shoot portraits with any focal length, but in a general sense, we're going to use an 85 millimeter to 135 millimeter for standard portraiture. This is going to be a business hip-to-head sort of headshot. This is going to be your classic senior, your engagement shoot, your wedding photography, that sort of thing. 85 to 135 is kind of our ideal general range to take portraiture. This is because we have a little bit more telephoto than normal. So if 50 millimeter, again, is what we see with our normal eye, if we add a little bit of compression, we add a little bit of telephoto to that, everyone visually just looks a little bit better. Now, environmental or group portraits, I like something a little bit wider because I'm not just including one or two people. I'm going to include a family or a wedding party, a subject matter with the background in play. Something between a 24 or 70 millimeter focal length is my go-to range for this type of portraiture. Lastly, every once in a while, you'll see like an ultra wide angle portrait. This is creative, and I've got a great example for that coming up. It's not used as often. It's not a fisheye, but it's a really fun way to use that wide angle expansion to get something a little bit different. So this is our classic portrait, 85 millimeter 1.8. Shot at a 2.8 f-stop, so we have a nice shallow depth of field. You kind of get an idea of where this lady is, but at the end of the day, it's about my subject, it's about this portrait. Second shot here, photograph taken with the 70 to 200 2.8. This one is another workhorse lens for most photographers. I like using a little bit more of a telephoto, like a 135 or a 200 millimeter. When I'm in a busy scene where I'm not necessarily have a lot of control over the environment, but I want to highlight one individual, or I want to isolate my subject within a busy environment. And I do that with more of a telephoto lens. This 70 to 200 range I also use often for product work or studio still lifes, things like that. Like I said, the 70 to 200 is a workhorse when it comes to photography today. Compare a standard portrait to something a little bit more environmental. So this is 24 to 70, taking more of that 50 millimeter focal range. Again, because it's not just about the subject matter in this photograph, it's about where he is, what he's doing, to help tell the story of who he is. This wider angle, again, is great for families. It's great for group portraiture. With a lens that's a little bit wider angle, I can make sure to get everybody in and still be close enough to communicate with my subject. So if I need, if I need to grab a little kid's attention, or if I'm trying to make noises so the dogs will actually look at me, having that wider angle is a great tool to allow you to communicate with your subject, as well as getting everybody in the frame. This is an example of that classic normal lens. So any journalist or working newspaper photographer, especially those photographers who come back from using film, back when like the A1 or the K1000 were really popular. You'd get your film camera and then you'd get your nifty 50, and they would live together, and you'd make so many images with that combination. Tamron makes a really great 45. It's a nice, small, compact lens, and so I can capture the world as I see it as I'm walking around. It's great for travel. It's great for just everyday shooting. This is an example of a creative portrait. So with a creative portrait, it goes one step beyond environmental. Maybe I've got a large background that I want to include. In this one, we were doing a pinup shoot with an airplane, an old airstrip. I don't remember what kind of airplane it is, but I could only get this type of image with a 15 millimeter, something that was very wide. This another one is a great example of wide angle expansion. So this one taken at 15 millimeter. The roller skates are literally larger than life. It creates just a different view, something that maybe isn't as normal every day. I'll also use an ultra wide angle for kid portraits. I'll have them grab their favorite toy, whether it's a Hot Wheel or something in Legos that they build. If they hold that really close to my lens, and then I'm taking their photograph back here, that toy is going to seem larger than life. You can see how big my hand is right now. That's wide angle expansion properties right there. Yeah, it's kind of fun. Moving on to landscapes. There's basically two different kinds of landscapes. There's standard landscapes and then my telephoto landscapes. Standard landscapes, we're going to see in that wider angle range, anything from a 10 to a 70 millimeter. Trying to capture the world as we see it, get as much of it in as we can. The telephoto landscapes use traditionally like a 100 millimeter up all the way to a 600 millimeter lens. Using the telephoto allows us to isolate certain portions of the landscape that we find interesting and allow them to compress and stack on top of each other. Let me show you what I mean. This first one, this is Horseshoe Bend out in the National Parks region, 15 to 30. The 15 millimeter on my full frame camera gave me 110 degrees angle of view. So basically sitting on the edge of that cliff, of course, at a safe distance, so I don't, endanger myself. I had just enough focal length to get everything in, so I didn't have to do any kind of panoramic or stitching after the fact. And you can only do this with an ultra wide angle lens. These ultra wide angles are also great for astrophotography. So the 15 to 30, a 10 to 24, something in that range is great for capturing the Milky Way imagery. Got a little bit of painting with light there in the foreground of the arch just to help light up that detail. Anything with a 2.8 at a 24 millimeter or wider is going to be great for astro work as well. Here's an example of kind of a standard landscape. Personally, I like to put people in my landscape just to give it a little bit more of an engaging or invitational feeling to it. People also help with scale, so you can kind of figure out, how large that cliff face is, or, how large that lake is. This one was taken with the 17 to 28. It's a Sony full frame lens that Tamron makes. I can get a similar image with like a 24 to 70 or like a 35 millimeter, something like that. Telephoto landscapes. So this is that compression, this is that layering aspect that I was talking about here at the White Sands National Park, again in the southwest region of our country. I love the contrast here. The sun was setting, so that we had a really great contrast of the light areas and the shadow areas, and using a 200 millimeter lens here, I was able to really just kind of, again, layer that up like a nice 7-layer cake. Here's another great example, the 35 to 150 taken at that 150 millimeter focal length, just highlighting again the way the sand there just kind of comes up and over the horizon. With photos like this, it does matter where you are, but it doesn't necessarily matter where you are. It's about what do you find interesting about the things that you are photographing, and how can we highlight those through compression. All right, with wildlife, just like a telephoto lens, if you happen to bring it out on your hike anyways, and you happen to see something interesting, whether it's a squirrel or an elk or a bird, the telephoto range is really going to be your best friend in this application. Your standard telephoto, a 300 millimeter or a 600 millimeter is preferred, especially when you get into those areas where it's more vast, when you've got 200 yards or 500 yards that you're trying to zoom in on. A walk around compact is going to be 70 to 400 millimeters. So these lenses are going to be like a 70 to 300. Even a 55 to 250 that you'll get with your camera body is a good walk around compact telephoto lens. Tamron makes a 100 to 400 here that gives you just enough range, but it's still small enough that you can take to the zoo, you can walk around with. When we talk about a 600 millimeter lens, look it up, it's a commitment. It's not necessarily heavy. They come in at about 4 pounds versus 2 pounds, but it's a commitment. It's something that you have to want to take with you on your hikes and on your journey. But with a 600 millimeter, you can get something like this. This is a gentleman elk that was out in Yellowstone National Park last September. So it was rutting season. He was looking for a lady, and they were about 200 yards out. Thankfully, this guy stood still for about 5–10 minutes. He was out in the middle of this field, and I got a really good series of him bellowing and just kind of making his way across the early morning light. But a 300 millimeter in this shot wouldn't have caught it. I would have had to crop in considerably to get an image like this. Secondly, if I've got any other birders in this group, hello. Again, thank you for joining us. I love birding. I love the fact that you can practice with them and they come back every year, especially during migration. This one was actually taken up in Swan Lake. It's up by, I want to say Monticello. Completely escaping me. But look up Swan Lake here north of the metro area in Minneapolis, and you will find this. Testament to the 150 to 600. This was in January, and in January it's a great time to go check it out because there are tens of thousands of swan and geese and ducks that hang out in Swan Park, Swan Lake. And there's a gentleman there that feeds them, and so they come by at 10 o'clock every day like clockwork. You can go in, there's a little deck, there's a free will donation sort of can, and you just get to practice as they fly in. This is one of 200–300 images that I photographed. So if you don't get it right, just keep trying. And the goal here is to get one out of many that you can show and you can be very proud of. But again, that 600 millimeter is a great sort of ultra telephoto to really bring in and zoom in those subject matters as they're coming in from a far distance away. When we talk about motion, so this is a 100 to 400. Taken at Canterbury Park last year, just kind of there practicing. Again, repetition is the best practice. This one was taken at 125th of a second. The first one was at a 250th of a second of those birds. And at 400 millimeter, I'm going to focus right in the center of the frame, and I'm just going to move with them as they go. from left to right. If I keep my subject in the center for both the birding and any moving subjects, you're going to have a better result. You're going to have faster focus in the long run. All right, sports photography, that leads us into the next section. With sports photography, it's really very similar focal lengths if I'm outside or if I'm in an arena. Basically, if I'm photographing sports that have a larger field, I'm going to need a telephoto lens. In baseball terms, a 300 millimeter lens will get you a full body photograph of a second baseman from the outfield at 450 feet. If I'm out in center field and I have a 600 millimeter lens, I'm going to be able to fill the frame with the catcher and the batter on the other end, just to, again, give you a visual of what that looks like. If I'm focusing on the infield, I can get away with a 300 millimeter for sure. That'll get me first, second, third base. In soccer, a 300 millimeter from one goalpost will get you halfway across the field. A 600 millimeter will get you the goalie on the other side. Again, just to kind of put this into perspective. If you're inside, or if you're able to be courtside or next to the action, you can use a wider angle lens. Use a 24 or a 35 millimeter anytime I want to get like a half court kind of scene. A 200 millimeter will get me across the court. So if I'm shooting defense and I'm on the opposite side for basketball. If I'm shooting offense and they're on my side of the court, I'm going to be sticking around like a 70 or a 100 millimeter lens. I know this is a lot of numbers. I hope this is still kind of making sense for everyone. Here's a great example of 600 millimeters. So this is at Viking Stadium during the Minnesota State High School League Championship tournament. 600 millimeter lens at f8 was just fine with all of the studio lights that they had going on the field. And it captures wonderful color, it captures wonderful saturation, and it was fast enough shutter speeds with newer cameras. Keep in mind, if you have a good high ISO, you can still get nice fast shutter speeds, even at an f8. Cameras today are actually very, very smart, long way from where they used to be 10 years ago. This is 35 millimeter, sitting courtside. And I love the 35, I love the 1.8 because the lights have a really easy tendency to kind of starburst out. So this one was photographed at f8 with a high ISO, but I was able to get all of the little starbursts of the lights up top, and that was the goal of this shot. Last subject matter, macro. Now, this is kind of at the beginning, that question of, do you want to get closer to things? If you want to get closer to things that are small, the next question becomes, how small is the thing you want to photograph? We'll talk about macro versus close-up photography very briefly. And close-up photography is something that you can do with most lenses. If you want to do true macro, you need a specific tool, you need a specific lens to be able to do that. This is an example of that true macro, that one-to-one macro. This is a penny. Same thing with a quarter. When we talk about true macro, it's a life-size representation of the object if you were to place it on the sensor. Now, if you were to actually open up your camera so you can see the sensor plane, or if you have a mirrorless camera, simply take the lens off. And if you were to take your subject and put it directly on your sensor, huge disclaimer, do not do this. You will damage the sensor, but again, just for a visual, that photograph is going to be a direct representation of what that looks like if you were to place it on the sensor plane. You can only do this with a specific macro lens. It's a non-zoom, so it's a fixed focal length, and it'll give you a one-to-one representation. The next example is a close-up. So most people, their application is going to be for close-up work. You know, you want to photograph flowers in your garden, you want to photograph rusty hinges or locks or keys, or like, you know, a lot of little found objects. And you can actually do close-up photography with most lenses, especially in the Tamron line. This is something that that they are very good at. And how you do that is you take your zoom lens and you zoom it all the way out to its furthest telephoto point. So if you have a 35 to 150, I'm going to zoom it out to 150. If you have an 18 to 55, I'm going to zoom it out to 55 millimeter. If I've got a 70 to 300, I'm going to zoom it all the way out to 300 millimeter. And then I'm going to get within what we call a minimum focusing distance. Basically, it's that point before your subject gets too close and your camera can't find focus on it anymore. It's a simple technique. It's a fun thing to try when you're stuck in your houses. Basically, you zoom out the lens all the way out. You find something interesting from a reasonable distance and you focus on it. And then you get a little bit closer, focus on it again. Get a little bit closer, you focus on it again. There will be a certain point where your camera can't focus on it anymore. Guess what? That's too close. Back up a little bit. And that's your macro, that's your close-up capability. Seems simple, but I guarantee you there's so many people that I get to share that little tidbit with on the road, and it changes the game for most photographers. Okay. We're about halfway through, so I wanted to give an opportunity, if there's any specific questions, Ben, do you see about the actual focal length portion before we jump into everyday technology?
Not seeing any questions as of right now. I guess everybody's following along just fine.
Okay, good, wonderful. That was the fun artsy bit. The great part about this presentation is it conquers both right brain and left brain. We get the artsy focal length and compression. Again, how do you see the world? What type of photograph do you want to take? The second part of it is the tech part. So we're going to talk about light. We're going to talk about optics. We're going to talk about why technology is important and how the lenses have changed so much. Again, even within the last 3 years, the lenses have gotten so much smarter. They've gotten so much more responsive so that it's easier for you as a photographer to get sharper results and faster focusing. I'm not going to go through all of those technologies there. That's a lot. But there's a true fact if you look at a lens, if you look at the letters that go on the back of the lens, that's the technology. And every manufacturer has a different designation for what the different technologies do. I used to say that a lens is higher quality because it's got more letters behind it. It's the alphabet soup of technology. And that's true. So we're going to take a little bit of time and just talk about which ones are important and which ones you should pay attention to when you're looking for your next lens. So your lens, it has a few very simple responsibilities. This is the goal of what we're looking for when we're talking about lenses. It is a true statement that if you have a good sensor, you will get good imagery, but also the optics are so crucial in order to get a nice color and contrast, frame to frame, a good sharpness, edge to edge, just a general clarity and definition. It's like getting a pair of gas station readers versus going to the optometrist and actually getting a pair of glasses fitted for you. There is a difference, and hopefully this will help kind of differentiate them for you. So we have 4 basic responsibilities of our lenses. We want to keep the light bright. We want to keep that light white as it passes through the different pieces of glass when it hits your sensor. We want to keep that light straight. This is going to help for overall clarity. It's like a high definition filter for your camera. And then we want to keep that light defined. That's that edge sharpness, that overall crispness that you'll see in an image. When we want to talk about keeping the light bright, the compatibility of your lens and the sensor that you physically have does play a role. These are Tamron designations, but they translate into other camera manufacturers as well. So DI is for all digital SLRs, whether it's full frame or crop sensor. So if you have a Nikon camera, we're talking about an FX versus a DX camera. If we're talking about a Canon system, we're talking about full frame versus APS-C. DI2, that blue box that you see, is for only crop censored cameras. So we're talking only for those cameras that have a slightly smaller sensor size. DI3 is a designation specifically for mirrorless camera systems. Why this is important is the sensor size matters in the fact that we want to make sure that light will completely fill that whole sensor plane. So in a simple form, a DI2 lens or a crop censored camera has a slightly smaller sensor size. And so if we use a full frame lens on that, This is where I wish I had my little piece of paper, but like if this is my sensor, if you can see me picture-wise right here, a full frame lens will travel light bigger than your frame. So the light will be all the way up here, it'll be all the way down here, it'll basically completely fill your sensor. Now, if I have a crop sensor camera, so it's smaller, I can still capture my whole image plane with a full frame lens because again, my light is going everywhere. But with a specific lens that's designed for my crop sensor camera, the light area is going to be smaller, but it's still going to accurately cover that sensor plane. Now, if I put a crop sensored lens on a full frame camera, that light is not going to make it all the way around. It's going to stop, and you're going to get a very hard black vignette all the way around. You can crop it out. I call it a fine art filter sometimes, but it's basically meaning that that light isn't reaching all of the corners and all of the edges. It's really just focused towards the center of those smaller sensors. So point of this slide, double check your compatibility when you're looking for a new lens. Make sure the lens that you're getting is made for the camera that you have. Secondly, keep the light white. Basically, these are nods to when you have light that hits a prism, what happens? It's going to want to spectrum out. It's going to want to create that rainbow. And so the first thing here is just regular optical glass. This is more, non-digital glass. You see that there's red fringing or yellow fringing. The light isn't as white as it should be. It's not as focused as it should be. We use low dispersion glass or extra low dispersion glass for those tricky elements, again, just to help focus that light and to keep it white. Keeping the light straight. This is another clarity aspect. This is another sharpness aspect. When we have traditional lenses or our spherical normal lenses here, you can see that the edges of that light depiction is soft. It's not sharp. That is going to have less contrast, less clarity than my spherical lens that you see on the left-hand side. And a spherical lens is used when we have a lens that's asking a lot in a little package. So if you look for like an 18 to 300 or an 18 to 400, you've got a wide angle, a telephoto, you've got a lens that covers a whole range, but it needs to be very small also. So we use spherical lenses in those to better direct the light passing through those elements to keep it sharper, to keep it more defined, again, when it hits that sensor plane. Like I said, this is the techie part. Keeping that light defined. So one of the last things we ask our lens to do is, again, we just want that light to not have any refractions. We don't want to have that light having any distractions as it's going through. We want the light that hits the sensor to be the most correct and the most white as possible. This is how we get the highest quality images. The diagram on the left is an example of Eband coating. It's a nano coating that some professional lenses have. And basically what it's doing is it's creating a more transparent outer layer of your lens. This is why it's important to keep your lenses clean. That front element is crucial so that we can capture as much light as possible and make sure as much of that light enters the lens cleanly and it goes through to the sensor plane. Here's an everyday example. The one on the left has that Eband coating. The one on the right does not. You'll see this show up more in high contrast situations. So in this situation, I'm shooting directly into the window light. So my subject is backlit. If you see any lens flaring in your imagery, this is a good example of a lens that does not have proper coatings on the outside. That light is bouncing around and you can actually see it refracting in your image. Okay, so what does this mean? This is how it relates to everyday technology. Something that we want to look for. We want to look for performance. We want to look for professional grade lenses. They are definitely a lot more expensive, but these are lenses that are going to be made faster so they can autofocus and they can photograph faster shot per shot. They're going to be sharper overall. So we're going to compare like an 18 to 55 kit lens to a 24 to 72.8. There's definitely a difference there. They're also going to be more durable, and we'll explain why. In Tamron lens, we look for the SP designation. That stands for super performance. In Canon, this will be like an L glass. On Sony, it'll be like a G master. It's basically, again, that professional designation just to tell the consumers that this is a higher quality lens and justify the price point a little bit.
Hey, Jillian, we have a quick question coming in here, and you may
Sure.
get into this later. Jeffrey is looking. He owns 4 of the Tamron G2 lenses, but has never calibrated them. Could you explain the tap-in console, or generically how calibrating a lens works and helps you?
Sure. That is a great question, Jeffrey. Just again, to repeat the question for you guys, how do we calibrate the lenses? Is it important to calibrate the lenses? And the basic answer is yes, it is important if you are noticing that they are not as sharp as you think they should be. So cameras today are much smarter than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. They are basically computers. Lenses are also basically computers. So updating the firmware on occasion is going to be important, just like your cell phone, just like your operating systems on your laptop. The tap-in console is an accessory that Tamron makes where you can actually connect your lens to your computer with it looks like a hockey puck. It connects to the back end. And you can update the firmware very easily. You can micro adjust your lens if you know how to do it. The easiest solution if you feel like your lenses need some calibration or need a little bit of help is to talk to your manufacturer. Tamron specifically has a 6-year warranty on their lenses, and we are more than happy when the office opens back up again, hopefully someday soon, to take in those repairs and to work with you to make sure your optics are up to snuff. You can also ask if you can send in your camera body at the same time. So I'm going to back up a couple of slides here. When we talk about calibrating the lens or micro adjusting your lens, it's a perfect time for that question. What he's saying is we want to make sure, one more, we want to make sure that your light is hitting your sensor plane calibrated or correctly. If you, oh, sorry about that. Getting button happy. If it's not calibrated or if it needs micro adjustment, that's basically meaning the light is not hitting your sensor plane correctly. So in this situation, if this is your sensor, it needs to be moved up, or the light needs to be calibrated so that the sensor plane hits right here where that light converges. With that being said, this is not a call to action that everybody absolutely has to get every single lens calibrated. Again, it comes down to if it's not acting as if, or if it's not responding or performing the way that you expect it to, the first test is definitely reaching out and getting somebody else involved, testing that theory, making sure that there's nothing wrong, because it can happen, and it actually happens more often than it used to. Again, there can be slight adjustments in the sensor that needs to be made. There can be slight adjustments in the lens that need to be made. These two, camera by camera or lens per lens, differs slightly. And so if it looks soft, or if it looks soft on one side, if you are expecting it to be super tack sharp and it's not, there's certain things that we can test out to see if the calibration is necessary. That's the long answer. My social media links are going to be on the last slide, so if there is something you would like to discuss, please direct message me after this. I'd be more than happy to help. All right, jumping back in. Stabilization. Stabilization is important. It's something that we all take for granted. Stabilization only corrects for your motion as a photographer. It will not stop your subject's motion if it is moving. I got really lazy and I was photographing my nieces and nephews running around at 1/10 of a second and was really confused why they weren't sharp. It's because they were running, and at 1/10 of a second, you're not going to stop that action. But in this situation, this is at the Train Museum, at 1/8 of a second, if my stabilization is on, I can get a sharp image. If it's off, you can definitely see the difference. By nature, you'll get a 4 to 5 stop stabilization with your lenses. So in a real world example, we find our minimum shutter speed by going 1 over the focal length. You know, if we've got a 600 millimeter lens, we should get a sharp picture at a 500th of a second or faster. We'll do easy math. So if we have a 5 stop stabilization, we start at a 500th of a second, A one-stop stabilization is going to get us down to a 2/50th of a second. A two-stop stabilization will go down to 1/25th, a 50th of a second, or a 60th of a second, we'll say a 30th of a second. So in theory, if my stabilization is working well and I get a full 5 stops of stabilization, I can get a sharp photograph at a 600 millimeter at a 30th of a second. Everybody's different. It honestly depends on how much coffee I've had in the morning and how cold I am outside. But test it out, see what your own limitations are. And just know that with your stabilization on, it opens your world up to a whole new versatile world without a tripod necessarily, or without a monopod necessarily. If I am on a tripod, shut your stabilization off. Tripods do this thing where, you know, if you're completely stable and not motioning, the stabilization in all manufacturers will create its own motion to try to stabilize itself, and you won't get sharp images. So if you are sandbagged or if you're on a tripod, remember to shut your stabilization off. With autofocusing motors, there's different types. Basically, when we talk about autofocus, speed and performance comes in when you have different types of motors, but it also has to do with what kind of contrast you have. If you have more contrast, you are going to be able to find autofocus faster. Also, the center of your sensor is going to be the most sensitive to find autofocus. So if you're using, again, action, sports, wildlife that's moving, move your focus point to the center of the sensor and you'll be able to lock on faster. The first type is a ring type autofocusing motor. We use a USD, but there's ultrasonic motors. There is AFS and SSM. These are basically the fastest motors in any lineup. The second type of motor, this is going to be a stepping motor. We use either an STM or an RXD, a nano USM. These are just different designations for other manufacturers' motors. These are still fast, but they are smaller. So it allows you to make a smaller lens. The third type is basically a very small gear type autofocusing motor, which is where size is the biggest parameter. It's an HLD or an OSD. These do not have the speed, but it'll also come with a smaller price point and a much smaller build size. This is an example of a motor. This is the new VXD, the Voice Coil Extreme Torque Drive. Basically, it's a type of stepping motor. You'll find this in the new 70 to 180 Sony mirrorless lens that Tamron makes. But again, what we're doing is we're taking that light. These are two separate elements within your focal plane or within your lens, and by moving them back and forth, they'll actually focus that light. Again, so you have a sharp image. Last couple of slides, and then we can open it up. Another thing to keep in mind is is your lens protected against the elements? So moisture, dust protection. These are actual diagrams of the gasketing or the weatherproofing in Tamron lenses. You can find this on our website. All those little blue rings and the red rings are physical rubber gaskets inside the lens to help dust, moisture, oil stay out of the lens. Basically, this means you can take your lens in the rain, you can take it in the snow, you can take it on the beach. My rule is if my wipers are on like a medium, so it's not a downpour, you're fine. A rain cover is not the worst idea to have in your glove box, just in case. If you're a little bit more protected sometimes, or if you're a little bit more accident prone as well, having a little rain cover is just that go-to safety plastic bag that'll help seal everything up. But I am not afraid to take my lenses out on the kayak with me in the backyard. I'm not afraid to take my lenses out in the snow or the rain. There's always a cotton cloth or something to dry it off before I store it, of course, because we don't want that water to linger or to like seep in where it's not supposed to. But a moisture or dust protected lens, again, just allows you to take your photography outside in all different kinds of weather. They are not submersible. The easiest way also to tell if your lens has some sort of moisture resistancy to it is if you look at the back mount. So you open it up and like flip it over so you see the back mount. If it's got a little rubber gasket on the back, that's a good designation that your lens is moisture and dust resistant. The other cool feature that's gotten a lot of updates in the last couple of years is fluorine coating. Fluorine coating is I'm going to play this as well. It's like the Teflon coating to your lens. This is a great video that The Office came out with about a year ago. Just, it's a good representation of how durable the front elements of these lenses are. So this is a special coating that'll put on the front element, again, to keep it clean, to keep it protected. You'll see one side has the fluorine coating, the other side does not. That is a Sharpie marker. Not recommend you try this, but it does work. I actually have a sales rep out of Colorado who does this test on camera. It scares me every time he does it. He plays tic-tac-toe. Just another thing to look for out there. The last little nod I have before we open it up to our customizable conversation is just bokeh, Aperture Blades. This is a nod to your background, so the spherical highlights that you might see in the background of your images, having good bokeh or having good shallow depth of field will really help your subject stand out. If we have a distracting background, it's the first thing to distract your viewer's eye from your main subject. The one on the left is nice rounded aperture blades. The one on the right is more of a stop sign, or they are non-rounded aperture blades. The more aperture blades you have, and if they are rounded, you can dramatically see the difference here. All right, that's all I have. Again, I'm Belle Tamron USA. Jillian is harder to spell sometimes, so I go by Belle Tamron USA on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I'm always here, even though I travel 175 days a year. When I'm on the road, right now I'm home with everybody else doing virtual classes and trying to write some articles and putting some content out there. But overall, you know, thank you guys for joining us today. This is a wonderful opportunity.
All right, thank you very much, Jillian. Let's see if we have any questions coming in. That now is your chance. Anything about the Tamron lenses, technology, anything like that coming in? Clearly it was very informative because everybody seems to have their questions answered.
This is the short version, believe it or not. This class can run 2 hours long. It's a lot more in depth, and I see kind of eyes rolling back once I really get into it.
All right, we have one question incoming from Jeffrey as well. Does Tamron have any video lens aspirations?
Jeff, are you talking about cine lenses specifically, or digital
Yes.
SLR video?
He is asking about cine lenses.
Okay. At this time, I don't have any public or really private information that they are going to be coming out with cine-specific lenses. Keeping in mind that if you are doing handheld video with the Tamron lens lineup, anything with a VC, so the vibration or the stabilization, and anything with a USD motor is going to be really great for video. The way that our stabilization works, it's a 3-axis system where, you know, if I'm hand holding it and it's got VC turned on, it's going to follow me around in all 3 axes. So it's kind of like a gimbal head that's already built in.
Awesome. He said he's a big fan of the 70-200 G2 VC.
Me too.
I do know some video friends of mine have, I think they've sent in, I think maybe a Tamron lens or something else to be modified to be cinema lens, but that's, of course, off manufacturer recommendation.
Well, and that's the funny thing I've been seeing, you know, photographers versus videographers, there is a much, how do I put this likely? Like if I'm a photographer who does video, all of my brands are going to be in line with the same brand. Like I'm going to be very brand loyal. If I'm a videographer that has a whole rig setup, I've seen 8, 9 different brands to build one setup before, and they're more apt to just find whatever works. I've seen the 70 to 200 on a rig as well, where it's basically you hook up a gear system to the focusing ring, so that way they can better manually focus or have a little bit more fine control.
Awesome. Well, let's see if we have any other questions here.
What types of photography do you guys like to do? Are you portrait photographers? Are you landscape photographers?
Yeah, drop that in the chat window here. See what kind of photographers we have in the group or in the presentation today.
Believe it or not, I've been in the industry for about 15 years. I have heard every question. Personally, I'm an architecture photographer. I'm a macro photographer. I do a lot of commercial product work. But I've taught on all subjects, whether it's portrait lighting versus it's landscape and zoo workshop, something like that.
Like Jeffrey chimed in here. He does video of sports, St. Louis Blues, weddings, and wedding videography.
Oh, St. Louis Blues. They're a good team.
We've got Mark saying landscapes and wildlife, astrology too.
Okay.
Astronomy.
Astrophotography. Yep. If you know the Sunny 16 rule for photographing the moon, that's something fun to jot down and look up. For astrophotography, there is a specific equation that you can use to find your focal length, but my go-to is 3200 ISO at f2.8 at about a 30-second exposure. That's my starting point. That's if I'm photographing the Milky Way where there's not a lot of light.
Nice. That is a good rule of thumb to stick with.
Mm-hmm.
Start with at least. All right. Let's see any other comments here before we break. Give folks a second to type stuff in here. Now is your chance. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I take that silence as approval and a great presentation. So the next thing coming up for today is going to be the presentation from Alexandria Garcia, and that is going to be in about 25 minutes at 5:30. So be sure to tune in for that. And just thanks everybody for stopping in, and thank you, Jillian.
Yeah, thank you. Good to see everybody.